Brr, talk about a cold open.
Cold. So cold.
I've been thinking about Genshin Impact's moveset design. As is the case with all games that keep adding more and more characters over time, the newer characters all have significantly more elaborate gimmicks than the guy who hits people. And as much as it's easy to get caught up in debating how out of place it makes these characters feel, or how this inevitability could have been avoided, I also think it's fun when games explore more creative twists with movesets to better represent characters or make them feel more unique. Within moderation, of course. Plus, I always feel bad for some characters from much earlier on who, if released nowadays, could have been so much cooler. So, I'm fixing that? Let's get this one out of the way immediately because it's the most obvious example of a very much outdated kit, at least in my eyes, because my eyes are heavily trained to only focus on this little guy. Venti, the Archon of Anemo, was basically entirely outclassed before 2.0 even came out by a character who can do everything Venti could do in a far more versatile and fun way. And as much as I love Venti and don't own Kazuha, the good old Kaitahara has always seemed like everything Venti could have and maybe even should have been, all the way down to his world-famous Kazuha Slash. Making a character feel unique is tough with such a big roster, but it's especially crucial for someone as important as an Archon. And even though an Archon has the most justifiable reason to be closely tied to their region, making them more unique by just giving them mechanics specific to their home region and the characters in it would be kinda cringe. I can figure out how to make Venti unique without throwing on arbitrary gimmicks like limiting him to Mondstadt, but that leaves a pretty narrow target to hit with his moveset. My first thought for Venti was actually way too complicated, even though it seemed like a fun concept. Having his current tap skill just be jostle the enemies a bit to charge energy for your burst has always seemed lame to me, and my king deserves better. So I thought about being able to choose the direction of the wind with his skill. You'd tap the skill button and then have to press a directional input to choose which way you push your enemies, and you could jump to launch enemies up, or crouch to pull enemies down and draw them into the center of the skill like a lighter version of his burst. Obviously, the toss-up and pull down would be the most useful by a mile, but I just thought being able to push enemies in any direction you want would be really fun. In fact, I even thought about letting you use it in the air to push you around while gliding, but only the WASD directions would work because up would just be Kazuha's skill, and I don't want to replace him, and down would be pointless. But the issue with all this is that, one, it's way too complicated for just the tap skill. There's a lot more I want to do with his kit, and if we funneled our entire funds of cool features into just his tap skill, everything else in his kit would have to be so straightforward that we'd essentially be left with the same Venti we currently have. And two, I don't even know why you'd use any direction except up or down in combat, so as much as I'd love for this to be in Venti's toolbox of tricks, I scrapped it from the final concept. But I still told you about it, which is basically the same thing as including it, so consider yourself owned, I guess. To be more modest and realistic, I'd make the tap skill only be the down direction of the original directional idea, which I know I've been mostly representing as Faruzan's arrows, but to clarify, how I imagine it working is still that small initial tug to knock smaller enemies off their feet and bring down airborne targets, but then it leaves a short, consistent air vortex that lingers even after you switch off Venti. Similar to his burst, but oriented towards the ground, since a big downside of his current burst is that it holds enemies above where many attacks can hit them. It also feels necessary to make his wind slightly stronger at staggering enemies than it currently is, so it still scoops up smaller enemies, but larger targets should at the very least stumble, as most recent enemies have been too resistant to the whims of the Archon of Anemo. The hold variation of Venti's skill is entirely useless in combat currently. Now obviously that's the point. You tap the skill in combat and you hold the skill for doing things outside of that. However, taking some pointers from characters released after Venti, I think we can actually make this a fun skill for fighting. First of all, his held skill should activate much faster than it currently does, maybe just a bit slower than Kazuha's held skill. I also think that the initial gust of wind should scatter enemies away from Venti who are hit by it, as he's an archer and would benefit from being able to knock enemies away a bit. But why would you want that if you're never gonna attack with Venti? Because he's a bow user, and bow users are trash, you may ask. Well, let's apply the same fix here that every modern bow character has: empowered arrows. After you use Venti's held skill, your next, 3 charged attacks will be fully charged immediately, and will cause little wind bursts that reposition enemies. Yeah, I'm actually stealing Farazan's thing now. But Venti's will be much smaller instant air vacuums, so rather than tugging them in one big wind pull, you're gonna be inching them around with several smaller pulls. But I'll also steal Auroron's thing and say Venti should linger in the air while you fire his arrows, because I don't think Auroron has any real reason to use that in his kit currently. But this Venti definitely would, especially since he gets forced into the air with his skill. And to tie it all together, I'm completely replacing his burst. But why? Archons should exemplify the main traits of their element, and crowd control is basically exclusive to Anemo, so a supermassive black hole of wind is perfect, right? Well, I mean, I basically turned his tap skill into his burst already, but even then, Venti's burst is a big part of his issue. It's all or nothing for him. Either you can suck up all enemies in the local tri-state area, completely bypassing combat entirely, or you don't do anything. So I wanted to de-emphasize the crowd control and instead do a bit more with movement as part of his whole freedom thing. Plus, a bard character that doesn't buff people is blasphemy. So his burst is now him playing a song to buff your entire team, giving you increased sprint and/or attack speed. I'd also wanted to increase the duration of his wind gusts from his skill and empowered arrows, but most importantly, it should decrease the interruption resistance of enemies affected by his wind. That way Venti can help you toss around some of the bigger enemies who just refuse to be fazed by anything. Cause I think the best way to make Venti feel unique would be to lean into collision damage. That's the damage enemies take from collisions. Allowing Venti's burst to enable more enemies to be tossed around would already be great, but even more directly, you could give him a passive talent which creates blasts of anemo damage on impact, or simply boosts the collision damage enemies take. I love characters that basically enable new playstyles, so if Venti could turn the gameplay of tossing around enemies into an actually worthwhile action, that'd be tons of fun. Though maybe if I'm doing that, I should bring back the other directions for his tap skill so you can toss enemies around more. Nah, still too complicated. In fact, even without it, this is still a pretty complex kit, to be honest. My excuse is that he's an Archon, and I'm incredibly biased, and I'm not apologizing. But if you thought Venti had too many ideas, then how about a man that I basically made 3 entire possible movesets for? Well, I guess he's not a man, he's a
child. But I also go by Tartaglia. And you?
Childe's kit isn't that awkward overall. His insanely high cooldown if you use his stance too long is quirky, and he's a main DPS bow user, which is always going to feel a little bad, but it's a fun playstyle to work around once you get used to it. The only thing I'd say is bad about his current kit is that for some reason you can't do a plunge attack when he's in his melee stance, but honestly the main reason I bring him up is that Childe is probably the one character with the most options you could think of because of who he is and also what he does in his boss fight. So much so that I'm gonna break this up into 3 mostly distinct moveset ideas, starting with option 1, the most insane possibility. For any Tartaglia haters in the audience, the reason he's a bow user is because beloved Ajax is so addicted to fighting that the only weapon he's bad at is the bow, so he's using it to challenge himself. Although he doesn't even use it most of the time, which I guess makes sense if he's bad at it. Pretty epic environmental storytelling. That's not what that means. Anyway, this begs the question, if he's good at every weapon, what if he could equip any weapon, changing his normal attacks depending on which weapon type you have him on? Yeah, that's why this is the insane idea. You can represent him being bad at bows by having him use the bow like a melee weapon, which I feel like would be a very charming way to represent his mastery of everything except the bow. All other weapons are pretty straightforward to imagine how he'd use them, except for catalysts, which tend to vary a lot from character to character, but luckily I think his catalyst playstyle would just be the same as his current alternate stance from his skill, except probably slower to balance it out against the other weapons, and obviously add a plunging attack, because of course you should. Ultimately though, this is a lot of development effort just to let Childe pick some unconventional weapons sometimes. I like it as a concept because of how it represents an aspect of Childe's personality that's quite unique to him, but outside of giving you more options for weapon passives, there's not much to this. Plus, his skill and burst would have to be the same no matter what weapon he has, so he isn't just 5 characters in one, but those moves would just kinda be whatever you want to take from his boss fight. And if we're taking inspiration from his boss fight, we might as well do option 2. The one everyone else has already thought of. If you ask how could some old Genshin characters be updated, and you start talking about Tartaglia, the immediate first thought for many is to make use of his Electro Delusion. He's already a kind of stance-changing character with his current kit, so changing his alt form to just be Electro instead of Hydro immediately makes him entirely unique from every other character, and opens up a lot of fun possibilities for using him. But let's elaborate on that idea. Personally, I think this would be most fun if his skill had no cooldown, so you could switch back and forth as you see fit. In terms of attacks, it makes most sense for his kit to be basically the same, with his Hydro form being the bow, and the energy weapons being Electro. Though I actually think this could combine pretty well with the use any weapon idea, so both forms play the same, it literally just changes his element. Of course, normally for sword, claymore, and polearm users, the element you have doesn't matter to your basic attacks, but Childe's Riptide passive, where you leave a mark on the enemy with your charged attack that then detonates into additional Hydro damage later, would presumably change into an Electro mark if you're in that stance, and that would mean that changing elements when using a sword and such would still matter. But you could also have more differences between his forms outside of just the element. For example, while in Electro, his attacks could be quicker, but he hurts himself slightly to do them, because Electro is his delusion, and delusions are harmful to people who use them. Although, it kinda seems like this delusion doesn't actively hurt Childe, so applying a Bond of Life to him as he uses Electro could be a fun alternative. Bond of Life is that Fontaine exclusive mechanic that's essentially an anti-shield that you have to heal to clear it. Of course, it is largely a Fontaine mechanic, and while Childe was there wouldn't be much of a reason for him to have it. But no matter what, having both elements would make him a very interesting character to use. Though there's still his burst, and obviously if he's switching between his forms from his boss fight, then his burst should be his Foul Legacy transformation. This would work similarly to other infusion-style transformation bursts like Sino or Raiden Shogun, where most of his entire kit would change for a short period of time while he's in this new form. This form would definitely hurt him every time you attack, because we know for certain that using Foul Legacy hurts Childe. I think his skill would still just switch between Hydro and Electro with no cooldown, and his attacks would be infused with whatever element he's using. But there's no difference in attack speed between forms because there's no longer a downside to Electro specifically. There are, however, differences in what his normal attacks actually are. His Hydro ones are based off of his Crescent Tides attack from his boss fight, where he fires out slashes of Hydro that act as projectiles. Meanwhile, his Electro ones would just be basic slashes in front of him that deal more damage but have less range. And I think his charge attack could be a dashing charged attack like most spears have. Hydro has multiple slow hits dragging enemies with him, while Electro is a quicker single hit that just knocks enemies in the direction you're dashing. There's a reason element switching Tartaglia is such a common idea though, it just seems fun. But I don't think Genshin would do this. If they're gonna do element switching with anyone, it'd be Traveler. But that brings me to option 3. The much more reserved and reasonable fix. Let's just make his kit more fun, but not necessarily more representative of his character. As interesting as it is to be able to use his skill for as long as you realistically want at the cost of having a higher cooldown, I think it'd make much more sense to put his form change on his burst. His burst would just do the big slash that he does in his melee stance, and then afterwards, you're stuck in that melee form for a set duration of time. His skill is then open to be any number of things, but I think making it a damaging dash would be cool. What can I say? Childe is just dash coded. I feel it'd make sense to have the dash go away from enemies when you're in your bow stance, sending a wave of water out at your enemies as you launch yourself back. And in his melee stance, it can be a dash towards your enemies. But most importantly, when you're in that melee form, you should be able to plunge attack. Oh my...
I'm Mr. Imposter. I'm Mr. Sus.
Much like Albedo's story quest, his moveset is a little boring and largely fails to represent the most interesting aspects about him. Especially the burst, where he just throws some sparklers around, I guess. With so much of Albedo being focused on science, painting, and the creation of life, only representing that through his skill creating a flower is... fine, honestly, but I do want to do more than relegate Albedo to an off-field Geo DPS that doesn't actually work 90% of the time. So while his current skill is fitting for him, I'd still want to tweak it a bit. Similarly to Childe, I have a couple options you could do here, though I do have a favorite of the two. The first option is simple and retains much of how he currently plays. Allow him to place multiple flowers on the field. You'd likely have to reduce the duration of his flowers or make his cooldown longer, because the current ratio of cooldown to duration would allow for a little more than 7 flowers at once, which would be a bit ridiculous. But with a more balanced amount of flowers, the idea would be that more flowers on the field allows for more instances of geo damage more often. This would help mitigate his issues of enemies leaving the circle, destroying the flower, or a boss simply existing within the same time zone as where you want to place the flower, since you would simply have more around to place. However, the option I find more fun also opens up new playstyles with him. Surprise, surprise. I think the potential of using the lift of his flower in combat is cool, but no one actually does that, so let's fix it. We could start by making the flower itself bigger and have it only lift or descend when you recast the ability while the flower is on the field. This would let you choose to lift large groups of enemies who walk over it whenever you'd like, as a new potential strategy in battle. This also allows you to elevate yourself for the entire duration of the flower being on the field, meaning you can actually use it in a way to avoid enemies below you without being dropped every half second.
You got me.
I think the fact that the flower lifts you is supposed to be good for plunging attacks as well, but it currently takes too long to be reasonable, and so the lift usually gets in the way more than anything. So why not? Let's fix that too. Make the flower lift you faster, and have the geo follow-up attacks that the flowers do be stronger for plunging attacks specifically. Simple and clean is the way that I don't know any other lyrics to that song, so just imagine the rest of that joke. Though a more elaborate option is that when you plunge, the flower explodes in geo damage and moves itself to be under you again, automatically elevating you once more to set you up for another plunging attack. But this wouldn't extend the duration of the flower. In fact, I'd imagine it'd get smaller each time the flower's reborn this way until fully disappearing after the 3rd or 4th time. No matter what you do to his skill though, the easiest way to make it feel better is to make the flower construct more durable so it doesn't get destroyed by anything and everything, and make it so that when you place it near a boss, it just spawns the flower in the closest valid spot, rather than not placing it at all, because that's so cringe and basically forces me to pull a pop and twist to place Albedo's flower deliberately behind me so that I can actually use it. But that's all just ways to make his skill more interesting and open up more playstyles. The real issue is his burst. His current burst is really weird. I think it's supposed to be a quick, small DPS option, but it certainly doesn't do damage and doesn't really represent his quiet, research-focused personality. So instead, let's give him something fancy. Albedo's new burst could have him make a quick painting of your enemies that summons a geoconstruct copy of them. I imagine copying everyone in an area would be too much for the game to handle, so it'd probably just be a single target copy of the strongest nearby enemy. They already have ways of making enemies attack each other, so it'd be quite easy to just duplicate the strongest, make it hostile to other enemies, and slap a rock texture on it to show that it's a geoconstruct. The copy's attacks would exclusively deal geo damage, and would even activate an additional instance of the damage from Albedo's flower being on field, basically doubling Albedo's off-field damage output. Obviously, copying a boss would be kinda busted and broken, not in the good sense, but in the I have no idea how they'd make that work for some of these sense. So instead, there'd be a generic strong copy that's the same for all bosses and isn't actually based on the specific boss you're fighting. I think it'd be fun if that was a copy of Albedo himself, as that's very fitting for his lore. But this should ultimately keep him as an off-field Geo DPS while making him a lot more fun and interesting, I hope. You know, Geo is probably the least useful element to be an off-field applicator for, but hopefully the strength and quantity of Albedo's Geo damage would still make him fun in his own right. And at the very least, having a giant flower lift to change the battlefield and Geo homunculi versions of hilly trolls running around would make Albedo feel more like a distinct character on your team rather than him just being an extra yellow number that pops up when other team members attack. I'm just generally not a fan of kit designs where they feel like nothing more than an invisible damage boost to your other characters, so this next one should be no surprise.
I am the great astrologist Mona, meaning I'm the old hag. Respect my name.
I'll admit, Mona's an interesting one for me to include in this video because I haven't played her and don't really care about her as a character. But I am aware that her main purpose on a team is just to make number really big, which didn't seem very fitting for the best astrologist in Tevat that can peer into any future or whatever she does. Now, to be fair, looking into what her kit actually does, her burst seems quite fun, freezing enemies in place, and her skill seems underwhelming, but fine. Though the fact that her gameplay usually boils down to just burst, switch to a different character and let them do all the damage, still feels like there's room for improvement to make her a more methodical and tactical support. Like all taunt skills, Mona's Phantom of Fate is not very useful, so I'm just gonna change it entirely. We're giving Mona a skill similar to Nahida's or Charlotte's, where you can either tap it to quickly apply an effect to an enemy, or hold it and aim to choose who you apply the effect to. And let's take a note from Genshin descriptions and give this effect an unnecessary name: Predicted. Because having a name to say every time instead of just effect will actually make this easier to talk about, which I guess means it's not like Genshin descriptions, huh? Anyway, unlike Nahida or Charlotte, Mona can only apply Predicted to one enemy, either the closest one you hit with the tap skill or the last one you targeted with the hold skill. When an enemy is predicted, their next couple of attacks will be slower, and will steal that mechanic that's been in like 2 events and 1 local legend where there's a white flash right before they're about to attack. If you perfectly time a dodge with the assistance of the white flash and the slowed down attack speed, it'll hit your predicted enemies with an explosion of hydro damage, and give your team a damage boost for a short duration. This means Mona is still solidly a damage booster, but in a much more unique way than just giving it to you for free. It'd be like Beidou's skill, which I know most meta players don't bother with timing, but I find to be one of the most fun abilities in the game. For the most part, I've been hand-waving away passives and just leaving them up to viewer imagination. However, considering one of Mona's passives entirely relies on the phantoms from her skill that no longer exist in my concept, I should probably address it. But this is pretty straightforward. If you manage to dodge with perfect timing by using Mona's alternate sprint without an enemy being predicted, it'll apply the water explosion damage that her skill does, but not the damage boost. So you could craft an entire game plan around just dodging enemies with Mona, which I think would be great and would actually force you to engage with alternate sprints, an otherwise very underused mechanic. Though speaking of special mechanics that people don't tend to care about, I want to give Mona's skill a non-combat use as well. She has the held version where she uses her magic astrologist scrying abilities to predict enemy movements, but it'd be fun if she could use it to locate collectibles too. Any nearby collectible item, challenge token, or maybe even chest would be revealed in the area that you use her skill towards. But of course, there's still her burst, the main issue I had with her to begin with. I think having her burst suspend enemies in place is still a fun mechanic and should be kept, even suspending bigger enemies like larger hilly trolls, or at least majorly slowing the movement of any enemies who can't be frozen in place, like bosses. But that's kinda busted, right? Well, as soon as you attack one of the suspended enemies, they all unfreeze, and you don't have any boosted damage against them because you aren't attacking them during this. Instead, this is just a brief pause on the entire battle as a constellation is projected on the ground. Your goal is to run over every star on the constellation before all the enemies start moving again, which Mona's alternate sprint can help with since it's faster than normal sprinting. And as indecisive as ever, I have multiple options for the specifics of what could happen here. Firstly, what constellations show up? It could just be Mona's own constellation every time, but I feel like it'd be fun for it to be a random one each time. Random out of the entire cast? Definitely not. It could either be random out of a set selection of characters important to Mona, or just random out of the 3 other characters in your party. As for what you get for reaching each point of the constellation, it could simply just deal hydro damage to all caught enemies with each star you visit, meaning the specific constellation doesn't matter outside of just being a new shape. But if it's only constellations in your own party, you could restore a portion of energy to that character whose constellation it is with each star you walk over. Though if you went that route, it'd probably be best to not have the constellation be random, and instead have it always be whoever has the least amount of energy. However, the most chaotic, and therefore most fun option, would also work best if limited to only constellations on your team. And that's to have a unique effect happen depending on the element of the constellation. That effect would get stronger with each point you reach, and could even have a bonus effect if you get all 6, because I imagine the short duration of Mona's burst would make it difficult to achieve that every single time. And yes, I came up with an effect for every single element, so let's get through this as quickly as possible. For Anemo, there'd be a big gust of Anemo damage that groups up enemies into the center of Mona's burst after the duration runs out. The strength of the damage and the pull to the center would scale with how many stars you reached before the timer finished. At 6 stars, the vortex of wind will persist and hold enemies grouped up for a while. With Geo, each time you walk over a new point on the constellation, it'll do an individual instance of Geo damage, and once time runs out, you'll gain a shield that scales with how many total stars you collected. With all 6, every star on the constellation will grow into a rock spike that counts as a Geo construct, and explodes after a few seconds to deal more Geo damage. Pyro, similarly to Geo, causes bursts of damage with each star you collect, but the damage dealt gets stronger as you collect more until the 6th one deals a significant amount of damage. Plus, if you collect all 6, you get an overall damage boost to your team. Electro recharges energy to your entire team outside of Mona, with any excess energy turning into small strikes of lightning that target a random single enemy caught in Mona's burst. At 6 stars, there's just a final large lightning strike that deals a bit of electro damage to all the enemies and refunds a portion of Mona's own burst charge. Hydro works the same as Electro, but with healing your team instead of recharging their energy. But at 6, it summons a big wave of Hydro damage and applies a lingering healing effect over time for your whole team. Cryo actually works more like Anemo, where it only applies cryo damage in one big hit after Mona's burst duration has ended, but it'll also slow enemies on top of damaging them. At 6, it'll apply the freeze status to all enemies, or at least heavily slow the ones who can't be frozen. And lastly, Dendro also only applies at the end, dealing a bunch of Dendro damage and summoning Dendro cores, scaling with how many stars you collected. At all 6 stars, it'll leave a circle that continuously applies Dendro to enemies. And of course, all of this is probably more complicated and impossible to balance than Genshin would ever allow. They'd most likely stick to one of the simpler ideas where the constellation that spawns is always Mona's, and walking over each star just does hydro damage to everyone caught in the burst, yada yada, whatever. But I had a lot of fun with Mona's potential moveset, alright? This would be a totally unique playstyle that would majorly change how you approach battles and team building, so I went for it. But don't worry, for this next one we can calm down and have a tame, sensible moveset idea.
I'm Mommy.
Now, Inazuma and Beyond feels pretty outside the scope of a video focused on outdated kits, and her moveset doesn't even have a bunch of unused potential like everyone else. All Dehya lacks is strength, but I've been focused on how much the moveset matches the character or stands out unique against the rest of the cast more than anything. So this would be fine, but Dehya's so underpowered that it actually ends up ruining her moveset. So I don't think many would blame me for wanting to touch on her kit regardless, especially since she's been completely usurped by Moeka at this point. Dehya's a tough but caring bodyguard who guards with her own body, so her role as a damage reduction and interruption resistance style of defensive character is a beautiful way to represent that rather than just letting her give us a shield. But that's the kind of niche role where she'd have to be really good at those things for it to be noticeable and fun. And if I'm being honest here, Dehya's skill is already perfect in that regard. Perhaps the strength of her damage reduction could be turned up, but this skill is already the perfect core to her moveset identity. I mean, I could try to bolster her potential as an off-field pyro applicator, but that's exactly what Moeka replaced her in. We're not here for Moeka at home, we're here to emphasize her bodyguard aspects, and that really only falls apart with her burst. Dehya's current burst feels quite out of place with her skill, since it's very much a DPS option that requires her to be on field for a long time, whereas her skill is a defensive option that's mostly useful off field. Her burst also isn't actually a DPS option because she doesn't do damage. If she just dealt more damage, then her burst would already be quite a bit more fun, but giving it a more supportive function instead would help her dual potential as either a defensive support or a DPS. So let's make Dehya's burst heal her team with each hit while taking away her own health to keep in line with how her other defensive capabilities work. And for some DPS potential, you could make her deal more damage the lower on health she is. This would be balanced out by her one passive where she automatically heals when below half health, so you can't just bring her to low health and then get insane off-field damage. Though my other issue with Dehya's burst is just how awkward it is to use, because it doesn't function as a transformation burst, it's just a single long attack. If you jump or fall, it cancels the attack. No matter what attack button you press, or even if you don't press anything at all, it does the same single swing back and forth over and over. And it doesn't even activate things like Xingqiu's sword more than once because they don't count as individual attacks. So let's make her burst work more like Raiden's or Cyno's, where it's a different mode that completely changes up her kit. So obviously it wouldn't cancel itself, but she'd also actually have a charged attack and unique skill. You can have a big finishing punch that does a ton of damage and hits enemies away, or maybe a volcanic eruption uppercut that knocks enemies into the air, and this would make her burst far more fun to use. But because Dehya's issues were largely just number tweaks and some extra mechanics, I should point out that some of her constellations do help with a few of the issues I had, such as making her damage scale with HP so her defensive and DPS properties are more intertwined, or giving her burst a purpose outside of it not dealing damage. But I've basically already been ignoring constellations as those shouldn't be considered a part of a character's base design. A character should be fun without them, and I think my changes would accomplish that while still letting those constellations be fun bonuses. Also, accounting for all constellation effects would take forever to think about, so I ain't doing that. But with Dehya sorted, is that all? Surely there isn't a sixth character I'd want to update. Well, no. There's way more than that, so let's do a rapid-fire round of small touch-ups I'd make to several other characters. To start, a big thing is I want there to be actual timers on abilities. It doesn't have to be giant bars next to your character like the Notland characters have, but even just a circular bar around the skill or burst icons in the corner, or next to the character icons on the side would be really nice. As for specific characters, I'm generally not a fan of when bursts are just a character's skill, but again, like Sucrose's. But honestly, Sucrose's burst is the more useful one in terms of her role as a support, so I'd probably change her skill. We can make it a different Animo Cube attack, the Vacuum attack, so her skill will draw in enemies but then launch them away from the center with Animo damage, though its main use would still be charging energy for her burst. Klee's a quirky case where the only adjustment she needs to be fun is for her attack animations to not be the absolute worst feeling attacks in the whole game. When your character requires animation canceling to play well, there's a design flaw there. Although letting her burst persist after she switches out is also a very common, simple fix suggested for her. But that's basically like saying, I'd like her better if I didn't have to play her, so still not a glowing review, and I'd rather her attacks just feel better to use. With Ningguang, I kinda just want her walls to make your projectiles more powerful when they pass through the wall, rather than the current effect of giving you a geo damage bonus for running through it. You could have Ningguang deal an extra instance of geo damage alongside projectiles that pass through the wall, like a ranged specific version of Albedo's off-field DPS. It makes more sense for you to want to stay behind her shield rather than going through it, but also a support for the playstyle of staying back and using projectiles is sorely needed. Currently with Eula, you just set up her burst and then whack people with your big sword until the burst activates. Her attack animations are great for making her seem like a dancer, but her gameplay fails that goal, as there's really no reason to actually dance around. So I'd maybe replace her skill with a dash. It could be like Yelan's, where you can even hold it to run around ice skating. Or you could give Eula an alternate sprint, like Ayaka and Mona, since tapping an alternate sprint to dodge attacks can often feel like dancing around more than running. It feels weird that Kirara's burst is entirely a damage burst when her skill is an HP scaling shield. Personally, I think it'd work well with her delivery motif if her burst was a speed boost, probably movement speed, and if I'm being greedy, cooldown reduction? And lastly, for Thoma, they should add a broom polearm and then he'd be perfect because his burst would literally be sweeping. So, fellas, I think I've made it clear that I'm the best ideas guy you could hire. I explain things in such a complicated and long-winded way, I'd fit in perfectly with all of your modern designs. Cease and desist!